Number 1. Roger Caleb Rogerson. Roger Caleb Rogerson was once one of the most feared and decorated detectives in Australian history. Born on January 3, 1941 in Sydney, New South Wales, Rogerson would go on to build a reputation as a relentless lawman, praised publicly, feared privately, and later exposed as one of the most corrupt figures to ever wear a police badge in Australia. Raised in Bankstown after moving from Bondi at a young age, Rogerson grew up in a working-class household. His father, Owen Rogerson, had immigrated from England, while his mother, Mabel Boxley, came from Wales. By his late teens, Rogerson had already set his sights on law enforcement. In January 1958, he joined the New South Wales Police Cadet Service, beginning a career that would span decades and end in disgrace. By the 1970s, Rogerson had become a rising star within the NSW police force. He worked on some of the most notorious cases of the era, including the Toe Cutter Gang murder investigations and the infamous Whiskey A Go Go nightclub fire in Brisbane, which killed 15 people. Rogerson was brought in from Sydney to assist after suspects claimed the crime was connected to organized criminals from New South Wales. Throughout this period, Rogerson developed a reputation for getting results, no matter the cost. He received at least 13 awards for bravery, outstanding policemanship, and devotion to duty. But behind the commendations, troubling patterns were emerging. Rogerson was known for extracting confessions through unsigned interview records, commonly referred to as police verbals, a controversial practice that allowed officers to fabricate statements without a suspect's signature. In 1978, Rogerson was assigned to the Ananda Marga conspiracy case. Years later, defendants would claim that Rogerson fabricated confessions that played a key role in their convictions. These claims planted early seeds of doubt about the detective's methods, but at the time, his power within the force shielded him from scrutiny. In 1981, Rogerson shot and killed Warren Lanfranchi during a police operation. Although a coroner ruled the shooting occurred in the light of duty, the jury refused to conclude that Rogerson acted in self-defense. Allegations soon followed that the killing was an execution rather than a lawful shooting. Lanfranchi's partner, Sally Ann Huckstep, publicly accused Rogerson of murder and repeatedly demanded an investigation. Years later, Huckstep herself would be found dead, her body submerged in the pond in Sydney's Centennial Park. As Rogerson's name became increasingly associated with violence, corruption, and organized crime, more accusations surfaced. Fellow police officer Michael Drury claimed Rogerson attempted to have him killed after Drury refused to accept a bribe to tamper with evidence in a heroin trafficking case. In 1984, Drury was shot twice through his kitchen window while feeding his young daughter. Rogerson was charged, but later acquitted, despite testimony linking him to underworld hitman Christopher Dale Flannery. By the mid-1980s, Rogerson's career was collapsing. He was dismissed from the New South Wales police force in April 1986 while under investigation for corruption and attempted murder. After leaving the force, Rogerson transitioned into the construction industry and later reinvented himself as a controversial public entertainer, touring the country with spoken word shows where he glamorized his policing career. In a shocking twist, Rogerson later admitted to journalists that evidence had been fabricated during the Whiskey A Go Go investigation, claiming police knew the suspects were guilty but lacked proof. He was later convicted of perverting the course of justice after being caught hiding large sums of money in bank accounts under false names. Despite multiple prison sentences throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Rogerson remained a public figure. He wrote an autobiography titled The Dark Side and appeared on television commenting on Australia's criminal underworld, often portraying himself as a misunderstood cop targeted for doing his job too well. Everything changed in May 2014. Roger Rogerson, then 73 years old, was arrested and charged with the murder of 20-year-old university student Jamie Cow. Prosecutors alleged that Rogerson and fellow former detective Glenn McNamara lured Gow into a drug deal, murdered him, and stole nearly 3 kilograms of methamphetamine. Gow's body was later found in bushland, wrapped in plastic. After a lengthy and controversial trial process, including one aborted trial due to prejudicial remarks, a retrial began in 2016. This time, the evidence was overwhelming. On June 15, 2016, both Rogerson and McNamara were found guilty of murder. In September 2016, Rogerson was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge described the killing as brutal, calculated, and motivated by greed.
Appeals were attempted, but ultimately rejected by every level of the court system. Roger Rogerson died in custody on January 21, 2024, at the age of 83 after suffering a fatal aneurysm. His death triggered mandatory investigations due to NSW protocols surrounding deaths in custody. A coronarial inquest later concluded that he received appropriate medical care. Once celebrated as a hero of Australian policing, Roger Rogerson's legacy is now defined by corruption, violence, and betrayal, a chilling reminder of how absolute power can rot from within.
Number 2. Louis John Eppolito. Louis John Eppolito was born on July 22, 1948, in Brooklyn, New York, into a life most people would spend their entire lives trying to escape. Organized crime wasn't something Louis learned about later, it surrounded him from the moment he was born. His father, Ralph Eppolito, was a soldier in the Gambino crime family, widely known on the streets as Fat the Gangster. An uncle called Jimmy the Clam, along with a grandfather and a cousin, were all made men. By the age of 10, Louis was already accompanying his father on bookmaking rounds, quietly absorbing the rules of a world governed by fear, loyalty, and violence. By his early teens, Louis understood the unspoken truth about his family. His father killed people for money. When Louis asked where certain men had gone, his father would simply reply, "He had to go." No further explanation was ever given. Violence was normalized, but so were ideas of honor and loyalty, values Ralph Eppolito repeatedly drilled into his son, often through beatings that left lasting scars. Despite his upbringing, Louis appeared to take a different path. After watching several relatives die at the hands of rival gangsters, his fascination with organized crime faded. He attended Erasmus Hall High School in Brooklyn, excelled in sports, and developed a passion for bodybuilding. In 1967, he was crowned Mr. New York City. 2 years later, in 1969, the same year another future figure of infamy, Stephen Caracappa, joined, Louis Eppolito entered the New York Police Department. It was an unlikely transformation. The son of a mafia soldier now wore a badge. But to Louis, the transition made sense. He later said that police officers and gangsters lived by similar codes: discipline, loyalty, and a belief that justice could be delivered outside the law when necessary. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Eppolito built a strong reputation within the NYPD. He earned medals, promotions, and public praise. Yet behind the scenes, warning signs were already present. In 1984, raiders nabbed the New Jersey home of Rosario Gambino, a major heroin trafficker. Inside, they found confidential NYPD intelligence reports, documents that could only have come from inside police headquarters. Eppolito's fingerprints were on them. Though he was suspended and faced internal charges, Eppolito was ultimately cleared in a departmental trial and returned to duty. Years later, a federal judge would harshly criticize the NYPD for failing to discipline him, calling it an inexplicable failure after he was caught passing sensitive information to a mob figure. By 1985, Eppolito had crossed a line that could never be undone. Alongside fellow detectives Stephen Caracappa, he began secretly working for Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso, the ruthless underboss of the Lucchese crime family. What began as information sharing quickly escalated into murder for hire. Prosecutors later revealed that Eppolito and Caracappa were paid $4,000 a month, plus tens of thousands of dollars per hit, to eliminate people who threatened the mafia. Their first known killing was a Long Island jeweler who was suspected of cooperating with the FBI. Using a confidential police database, the detectives tracked his address, vehicle, and license plate. They pulled him over under the guise of police business and told him to follow them to a precinct. Instead, they led him to a Brooklyn building where he was murdered. Eppolito stood watch. Over the next several years, they were involved in at least 8 gangland murders. The victims included rival mobsters, FBI informants, and even an innocent man killed simply because he shared the same name as Casso's target. In multiple cases, Ippolito and Caracappa also fed the mafia the names of government witnesses, effectively signing their death warrants. Despite these crimes, both men continued to serve as NYPD detectives. Ippolito retired with a pension, moved to a gated community in Las Vegas, published a memoir titled Mafia Cop, and even appeared in Hollywood films such as Goodfellas and Predator 2, portraying law enforcement roles that mirrored the image he wanted the public to believe. The illusion collapsed in 2005. Ippolito and Caracappa were arrested in Las Vegas after years of renewed investigation, fueled in part by testimony from Anthony Casso. In 2006, a federal jury found both men guilty of racketeering and murder. They were convicted of participating in 8 mafia executions while sworn police officers. The fallout was massive. The city of New York paid more than $18 million to the families of 7 victims and nearly $10 million to a man who spent 19 years in prison after being framed by Ippolito. The case became known as the Mafia Cops scandal, one of the darkest chapters in NYPD history. Louis Ippolito maintained his innocence until the end. He was sentenced to life in prison and served his time at a high-security federal penitentiary in Arizona. On November 3, 2019, he died in a hospital in Tucson at the age of 71. Once hailed as a decorated detective, Louis Ippolito's legacy is now defined by betrayal. A man born into the mafia, sworn to uphold the law, who ultimately became one of the most infamous examples of corruption ever uncovered inside American policing.
Number 3. Stephen "the Stick" Caracappa. Stephen Caracappa was born on November 12, 1942 in New York City, a place where power, corruption, and organized crime often operated just beneath the surface. Unlike his future partner Louis Ippolito, Caracappa did not grow up surrounded by mafia royalty or notorious underworld figures. His path into corruption would not be inherited, it would be chosen. In 1969, Stephen Caracappa joined the New York City Police Department, beginning what appeared to be a respectable law enforcement career. He was intelligent, disciplined, and methodical, traits that earned him steady advancement through the ranks. In 1979, he was promoted to detective and eventually assigned to the NYPD's elite organized crime homicide unit, a position that granted him access to some of the most sensitive intelligence in the city. Within the department, Caracappa earned the nickname "the Stick." It was a reference to his cold demeanor, rigid discipline, and reputation for being unflinching under pressure. To his superiors, he was reliable. To criminals, he was feared. But behind the badge, Caracappa was quietly building a second life, one that would ultimately make him one of the most dangerous criminals in New York history. By the mid-1980s, Caracappa had crossed a line that could never be erased. Alongside fellow detective Louis Ippolito, Caracappa began secretly working for Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso, the ruthless underboss of the Lucchese crime family. What made Caracappa invaluable to the mafia wasn't brute force, it was information. As a homicide detective, he had access to confidential databases, informant identities, surveillance details, and pending indictments. That information became deadly currency. Prosecutors later revealed that Caracappa and Ippolito were paid a monthly retainer of around $4,000, along with tens of thousands of dollars per contract killing. Their job was simple: eliminate anyone who posed a threat to the Lucchese family. Their first known murder set the pattern for everything that followed. A Long Island jeweler suspected of cooperating with the FBI was targeted for execution. Using NYPD resources, Caracappa pulled confidential data: home address, vehicle description, license plate number. The detectives pulled the man over using police authority and instructed him to follow them to a precinct. Instead, they diverted him to a Brooklyn location where he was murdered. Caracappa took part directly in the killing. It would not be the last. Over the next several years, Caracappa participated in at least 8 gangland murders. The victims included rival mobsters, suspected informants, and even innocent men killed by mistake. In one case, a Brooklyn man was executed simply because he shared the same name as a Lucchese target. Caracappa never questioned the order. Worse still, Caracappa actively betrayed his own profession. He supplied Anthony Casso with the names of government witnesses and confidential informants, effectively handing them death sentences. Multiple FBI cooperators were murdered after their identities were leaked. Despite this, Caracappa continued to work as a homicide detective. In 1992, he retired from the NYPD on a disability pension and moved to Great Kills, Staten Island. Soon after, he worked briefly as a private investigator before relocating to Las Vegas, Nevada, following the same path as Eppolito. There, Caracappa attempted to live quietly, even working as a corrections officer inside a women's prison, an almost surreal twist given his criminal past. For years, Caracappa and Eppolito evaded justice. The turning point came when Anthony Casso was arrested in 1993. Hoping to save himself, Casso revealed that two NYPD detectives had been working as contract killers. At the time, prosecutors dismissed him as unreliable. No charges were filed. But the truth didn't disappear. In the early 2000s, renewed investigations, corroborating testimony, and financial records finally closed in. In 2005, Stephen Caracappa was arrested in Las Vegas and extradited to New York. The case shocked the nation. During the 2006 federal trial, Caracappa and Eppolito insisted they were innocent. They claimed they were victims of discrimination and corruption within the justice system, but the evidence was overwhelming. Wiretap records, witness testimony, financial trails, and detailed accounts of murders only insiders could have known about. The jury returned guilty verdicts. Stephen Caracappa was convicted of racketeering, obstruction of justice, extortion, conspiracy, and 8 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 80 years and fined more than $4 million. The fallout was devastating. New York City paid tens of millions of dollars in wrongful death settlements and compensation to men framed by corrupt detectives. The case became forever known as the Mafia Cops scandal, one of the darkest chapters in NYPD history. Stephen Caracappa never confessed. He died on April 8, 2017 at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. Unlike Eppolito, he faded from public view, silent to the end. Stephen Caracappa was not born into organized crime. He wasn't forced into corruption. He was a trained homicide detective who chose power, money, and loyalty to the mafia over the oath he swore to uphold. And in doing so, he became something far more dangerous than a gangster, a cop who knew exactly how the system worked and exactly how to destroy it. Number 4. Gerard Schaefer. Few figures in true crime history are as terrifying as those who hide behind a badge. We are conditioned to trust the uniform, to believe that the flashing lights in the rearview mirror signal safety. But in the early 1970s, in the humid, sprawling swamps of Florida, one man turned that trust into a weapon. This is the story of Gerard John Schaefer, a man who desperately wanted to be a police officer, not to serve and protect, but to hunt. Born on March 25, 1946, in Wisconsin, Gerard Schaefer was raised in Atlanta, Georgia. From the very beginning, his household was volatile. He resented his father, a heavy drinker and womanizer, and grew up believing his parents favored his sister. This alienation festered, leading him to describe himself as the illegitimate product of a forced marriage. When the family moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, they projected an image of suburban success, but Gerard was privately unraveling. As a youth, Schaefer exhibited classic warning signs of a future predator. He stole women's underwear and engaged in bizarre autoerotic behaviors, such as tying himself to trees in the woods to feel helpless. His sadism wasn't limited to himself. He admitted to hunting animals in the Everglades, shooting creatures he couldn't eat just for the thrill of the kill. He also cross-dressed, a habit he later claimed was a calculated move to dodge the Vietnam draft. His early relationships were equally disturbing. He met a girl named Cindy when he was 14, forcing her into violent role-play fantasies where he would simulate rape. She broke it off in 1963, narrowly escaping a darker fate. Schaefer would later boast that he began his actual killing spree in 1965 at the age of 19. Professionally, Schaefer was a drifter. He failed as a teacher, fired after only a few weeks for inappropriate behavior, and was rejected from the priesthood. His personal life was a shambles. His first marriage ended in divorce after 2 years due to cruelty. In 1971, he married Teresa Dean, but his eyes were set on a specific goal: total authority. He applied to become a police officer. Despite failing his psychological entrance exam, a massive red flag, he was hired. He was quickly fired for using police databases to stalk female traffic offenders. Undeterred, he moved to Martin County, Florida, where he managed to get hired again, eventually rising to the rank of deputy sheriff. The wolf had officially entered the sheep pen. On July 21, 1972, Schaefer attempted his signature crime. Utilizing his patrol car and uniform, he pulled over 2 hitchhikers, Pamela Wells and Nancy Trotter. With a cool, authoritative demeanor, he convinced them that hitchhiking was illegal and promised to drive them to a halfway house. It was a lie. Once they were in his vehicle, he drove them deep into the desolate swamps of Hutchinson Island. He dragged them out and at gunpoint tied them to a tree. The girls were terrified, convinced they were about to die.
But luck was on their side. Schaefer's police radio crackled. He was being called away on duty. He left them tied there, intending to return. In his absence, Pamela and Nancy managed to break free and ran to the nearest police station. Ironically, it was the very station where Schaefer worked. When Schaefer returned to the tree and found them gone, he called his boss, Sheriff Crowder, and said, "I've done something foolish. You're gonna be mad at me." Crowder promptly fired and arrested him. However, the justice system failed. Schaefer plea bargained his way to a short 6-month sentence. While out on bail, waiting to serve his time, Schaefer did not lay low. 2 months later, he went hunting again. He abducted 2 more hitchhikers, 17-year-old Susan Place and 16-year-old Georgia Jessup. He used the same modus operandi, luring them into his car, driving them to the mangroves of Hutchinson Island, and tying them to a tree. This time, there was no radio call to save them. Schaefer butchered the girls. Place was shot in the jaw and buried their bodies in shallow graves in the Oak Hammock area. By the time their remains were found in April 1973, Schaefer was already in prison for the assault on Wells and Trotter. The similarities between the murder scene and the previous attack were undeniable. Authorities raided his mother's house where he lived with his wife. Inside, they found a house of horrors. It wasn't just evidence, it was a trophy room. Police found graphic short stories written by Schaefer describing the torture of women. They found 11 guns, 13 knives, and a collection of personal items, jewelry, clothing, diaries, and, most chilling of all, human teeth. This evidence implicated Schaefer in the disappearances of over 30 women. When confronted, he claimed he found the items or that the teeth were planted by an ex-roommate. Police saw through the lies. To ensure he was removed from society permanently, prosecutors focused on the strongest case, the murders of Place and Jessup. In 1973, Gerard Schaefer was convicted and sentenced to 2 concurrent life terms. Life behind bars did not silence him. Schaefer became a manipulator of the highest order. He ran a mail fraud scheme from his cell, posing as a woman to trick lonely men into sending him money.
He became a jailhouse lawyer, gaining the trust of inmates only to sell their secrets to authorities for privileges. He even befriended fellow serial killers Ted Bundy and Otis Toole, reportedly discussing counter-forensic techniques with Bundy. Despite his conviction, Schaefer was litigious and narcissistic. He filed 19 appeals and sued true crime authors who called him a serial killer, even suing FBI legend Robert Ressler. In a bizarre twist, he once sued a writer simply for calling him overweight.
His most disturbing legacy, however, was his writing. Schaefer spent his time crafting macabre stories that blurred the line between fantasy and confession. One story, Whores, recounted hanging a prostitute. Another, Spring Break, described disemboweling a co-ed. These stories were eventually published by his former high school girlfriend turned author, Sandra London, in a book titled Killer Fiction. While he claimed they were fiction, police believed they were memories of cold cases. Gerard Schaefer's story came to a violent end on December 3, 1995. While incarcerated at the Florida State Prison, he was found dead in his cell. He had been stabbed 42 times and his throat had been slashed. The perpetrator was Vincent Rivera, a fellow inmate. Sandra London claimed the argument started over a cup of coffee, while others suggested it was a hit because of Schaefer's history of snitching. In the end, the man who hid behind a badge to hunt the innocent died in a pool of his own blood, surrounded by the very criminals he used to pretend to arrest. His legacy remains one of the most chilling examples of corruption and evil, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one wearing the uniform.